Hello and welcome back. In this video, we'll learn how to work with queues in Orchestrator. We'll start by creating a queue in Orchestrator, populating it with data using an automation, typically called a dispatcher. Then, we'll consume the transactions in the queue using another automation. This type of process is typically called Performer. Let's begin with a quick overview. Queues are extremely important for large-scale automation projects. They allow the storage and processing of basically unlimited amounts of data. The only condition is for the data to be organized in transactions. Queues offer a lot of flexibility by accommodating different data types, and they're a perfect fit for cases in which data is taken from different channels, standardized, and used as an input for other applications like SAP, ERP, or CRM. Let's see them in action. For this example, we have an Excel file with 3 columns: sender, receiver, and points. We'll build an automation project to process each row as a transactional item in a queue. Then, another automation will take each transaction and add the data to the points tracker form web page. The first 3 fields on the web page correspond to the columns in our Excel: sender, receiver, and points. But we have a fourth one, ID. This one is meant to secure our transaction using an SHA-256 hash function. We're using this online hash generator here. We're going to input the data in this format and generate the hash. And then this goes into the 4th field on the web page. Once the fields are filled in, we'll click Submit. What we have here is a classic scenario in which a queue is the best option, ensuring flexibility, optimal resource allocation, and security. Now let's automate. We'll start in Orchestrator by creating a new queue. Queues are folder entities, so we must create ours inside a folder. We're here in the Working with Orchestrator Resources folder. Let's go to Queues, create a new queue, and give it a name: Points Tracker Queue. There are several options here to configure the queue, such as Unique Reference, which prevents duplication of transactions, and Auto Retry function, for when exceptions are thrown. We'll leave them as they are. Tags help us to categorize our resources, so let's just add 2 labels to identify our queue. Queues are created empty by default and without a specific data schema. If you need them to have a specific schema, you can use JSON structures. Or we can set up SLA predictions by enabling the SLA. But let's leave this to off for now. Finally, we can set up a retention policy that helps us free up the database in an organized manner. Once we've set up all of our details, we can click Add. And here's our new queue with its details. We can also view more options for our newly created queue from the More Actions menu. Among others, we can edit the queue, add triggers, monitor the queue, or upload items. Alright, the queue is ready, so it's time to build the automations. We've already created 2 empty processes for this demo: the Performer and the Dispatcher. Let's open the Dispatcher and start adding activities. Once again, our dispatcher will read the Excel file and use each row in the table as a transactional item, so it'll populate the queue. To do that, we'll start with a read range workbook activity. Specify the path for our Excel and the name of the sheet with the data. We'll also need an output variable for the data that we're reading. Let's call it DT Points Tracker. Now, the easiest way to add the items to the queue from our file is to use the Data Manager panel. Let's open it. And here's our queue. If we drag and drop it in our workflow, we'll get this pre-selection of activities that use queues. The one that we're interested in is Bulk Add Queue Items, which does exactly what the title says. It adds the item to the queue in bulk. The Orchestrator folder path and the queue name are pre-filled in their dedicated fields. The only thing that we're left to do is to add the source for the data, which is DT Points Tracker. Great, let's run the process and see how it works. The execution ended successfully. If we go to the queues page and click View Transactions, we see that we have 99 items. So, all of the rows in the input file are now here in the queue as 99 transactions. By accessing View Details, we can see the content of each item. Moving on, let's now take care of the performer. This one will consume the queue. More specifically, it'll take a transactional item and input the corresponding data on the web page, including the ID. We'll obtain the ID from the hash generator. Let's open the performer process that we created and start configuring it. This time, we're using a flowchart. Let's add a getTransactionItem activity, connect it to the start node, and configure it with the Orchestrator folder path and queue name. Additionally, we need to create a variable to store the queue item data. Let's call it TransactionItem. This will be of a special data type called queue item. Having a specific data type accommodates different data schemas without too much data manipulation done up front. Note the distinction between queue items, which are items stored in a queue in Orchestrator, and queue item variables, which are variables used in Studio to process queue items. We refer to them exactly like this: queue item variables and queue items. Next, let's add an if activity and use the following expression as the condition. Transaction item is not nothing. This is to make sure that the transaction item isn't empty. For the then branch, let's add a use application browser activity. Indicate the points tracker web page where we'll input the data. And rename the do sequence to points tracker actions. To input the data in each field, we'll be using type into activities. Let's start with 1. Indicate the sender field. To input the right piece of data, namely the sender, we have several options. One of the easiest ones is to use the specific content method applied to the transaction item variable. In the expression editor, it goes like this: transaction item dot specific content of sender between quotation marks to string. And it looks good so far. We have 3 more fields to input to, so let's add 3 more type into activities. The first 2 are very similar to the one that we've just added. Let's indicate their corresponding fields and use the same expression, but just change the name of the field to receiver and points, respectively. But for the 4th type into, we need to get the hash and only then input it in the ID field. So let's add another use application browser activity that points to the HashGenerator web page. Now we need a type into for the input data. Let's add it inside the do sequence for this second use browser activity and indicate the input field from the SHA-256 generator, this one. OK, here we need to input the sender name, the receiver name, and the points separated by slash. Let's build the expression. It starts with transaction item dot specific content of sender between quotation marks dot string plus the slash character between quotation marks. Then we'll add a similar expression for receiver. Followed by another slash. And finally, the points. So we'll enter this expression in the input field of the hash generator, and it'll display the hash, which we then must extract. We'll use a getText activity for this purpose. So we'll indicate the output field of the SHA generator. To make it work, we'll need a new variable, Let's call it SHA output. As we'll use this variable outside of the use application or browser activity, what do we need to change here? Indeed, change its scope to our entire sequence, points tracker actions. Now we have what it takes for our last type into. The data in this SHA output variable. One more thing here. We'll add a click activity that clicks on the Submit button of the Points Tracker web page. And everything looks good. As we know, working with queues and transactions requires making sure that we aren't processing the same item more than once. For this, we need to update the status of the transaction item. There's a really easy way of doing it with the Set Transaction Status activity. We need to select the Orchestrator folder path and input the transaction item. As for the status, it's pre-filled as successful. We'll leave it like this, but it's worth noting that we could change it from the status field. Okay, now it's time to handle the stopping mechanism of this workflow. Stop allows us to create a safe closing path for the process. This requires using the should stop activity. We control the execution of the performer workflow via Orchestrator, and this activity is where the robot will check the command received from Orchestrator and store it in a Boolean variable. Next, we'll add a flow decision with the condition should stop or transaction item is nothing. Now for the true branch, we'll add a log message with no more transactions. As for the false branch, this needs to simply go to the first Get Transaction Item activity and execute all of the following activities one more time. And now the performer workflow looks good. Let's save and publish it to Orchestrator. It's time to see how this works. We'll first go to Orchestrator, Tenant and Packages tab, where we can see our performer package. Second, in our Working with Orchestrator Resources folder, let's create a new process. Select the performer package that we've just published, set the job priority, and click Create. All we need to do now is start some jobs. We already have a robot and machine template added to our folder. So we'll hit the Start Now button for our process. Execute the process 2 times. We'll click Start and see what happens. 2 jobs are already running. And if we refresh the queues page, we can see that 33 items were successfully processed, with an average time of 11 seconds. The next 2 are in progress, with 64 remaining. With this, we conclude our overview of how to create a queue in Orchestrator, populate it with data using the dispatcher, and then consume the transactions from the queue using the performer. How would the dispatcher workflow change if we wanted to use Add Queue Item instead of bulk Add Queue Items? Thank you for watching, and until next time, happy automation!